Hello there, my name is Thomas and welcome to this edition of British Culture, Albion Never Dies. This episode is entitled C is for Crumpets. Thank you very much to everybody who got in touch with me. More than 25 people got in touch with me telling me what their C for British culture was, and there's quite a wide range of answers. In fact, there were more than 25 topics. Lots of people sent in multiple topics, and some people sent in the same topic, but sometimes using slightly different words. So it's between 20 and 30 different topics. I'm going to try and cover quite a few of them, but in varying levels of detail. And it would be remiss of me not to say thank you very, very much to everyone who wished me well on the occasion of my wedding. So about last week, July 31st, I got married, and it was live streamed on the internet, which meant that many friends and family all around the world were able to join, and I was overwhelmed with the well wishes from people I know, people I've known and loved for many years, and some people I've never met. In fact, quite a lot of people I've never met, so I really, truly appreciate it. We went on honeymoon for a week and then have come back, but even on honeymoon, as I say, I was asking on Instagram and in a few other places, like on my Chinese social media, what does C stand for? And overwhelmingly, it was C is for Crumpets. My wife is from the United States, she's from California, so she was asking, who exactly is saying C is for Crumpets? Is it Americans or Brits? The first person to say C is for Crumpets was my friend Ian, who is in China, but he's from the United Kingdom, and he said, you've got to cover Crumpets. Then there was Kid Bond Fan on Instagram, so Kid Bond Fan is from the UK, and then Bond Suits, that's a blog I've been following for about 5 years, The Suits of James Bond, and I got the book recently. It was fantastic, written by Matt Spicer and Pete Brooker. So it was Matt Spicer who suggested Crumpets. Again, he's based in the US. Easy Smiles and Expensive Watches on Instagram is from the US. And then Josh Trett, a filmmaker based in the UK, also suggested Crumpets. That's 5 people out of 25 suggested Crumpets. So this seemed to me relatively straightforward. What is a crumpet? But then I was listening to the QI podcast. So if you don't know it, QI is a BBC TV show, quite interesting. And it's a quiz of all kinds of fun facts. I enjoyed it. The first half of seasons that they have, every season is named after a letter of the alphabet. So I enjoyed, I think, A to M particularly, when Stephen Fry was the host. But recently I've really switched to the podcast, which is No Such Thing as a Fish, and it's all their researchers just telling the fun facts, really. And in the most recent episode that I listened to, they talked about the first Polish language encyclopedia. And in the first Polish language encyclopedia, according to them, a horse is defined as everybody knows what a horse is. So I was thinking of defining crumpets, and then I was thinking everybody knows what a crumpet is, and then I was trying to put it into words myself, and actually had a slight problem, so I quickly Googled what it was, and one of the best definitions I came across was from The Daring Gourmet. So it's a blog about travelling the world through your taste buds, and they had an authentic English crumpet recipe that really seemed right to me. And the blogger was saying, when I first moved to England, apparently he or she lived there for 7 years, there are a number of quintessential British dishes that eager to try. They tried crumpets just straight from the supermarket, thoroughly disappointed, and was wondering why such a bland, spongy thing should be so popular in the UK. And then many months later was invited to a friend's home, and the friend cooked fresh crumpets, and they were absolutely delicious. So she got on it and about how to make them. And to be honest, I don't make crumpets. I was going to try and make one before this podcast, but frankly ran out of time. But it's very, very similar to making fluffy pancakes. So I have a pancake recipe where I'll add in, I think bicarbonate of soda and water first, so you get all the bubbles, and then you make these really bubbly pancakes that are quite thin, but very light and airy. And a crumpet, simply you get a crumpet ring, a metal circular ring, put it on the frying pan or griddle, whatever you use, and then it gives it the extra depth. So it has a bit of depth, so it's like a thick, fluffy, bubbly pancake, and it's served with, I'd say, jam and cream, and that gets into cream tea from Shrublands Fitness, again based in the UK, was suggesting cream tea should be the C for this episode, and I really like that. Cream tea is a term I've generally heard in the south of England for what I think in standard English would be afternoon tea, and I believe in Australian and New Zealand English is high tea. So it's that kind of meal we might have around 4 o'clock where you have perhaps 3 different levels of different foods. So you might start off with something savoury, then a little bit sweeter, then very, very sweet to finish, with a traditional tea set, something you have on special occasions, not every day. Tea and crumpets, well, that might be something a bit more common because, frankly, there's less to do if you're just having the crumpet and just having the tea. And then there's the big question, do you have it Devonshire style or Cornish style? So I believe the Devon is where you have the jam on the top, and the Cornish style is where the cream is on the top. There was a question from someone, what is the difference between an English muffin and a crumpet? The answer to that is that I have never ever had an English muffin in the UK, and when I looked into it, English is not the place where it's from. English is the name of the man who invented it. There's a man called Thomas English who invented the English muffin in the United States, and then it's become widely known as the English muffin. I think mistaken as an English thing. It's an English thing as it's from the English family, but not from the country England. So no relation. My first time having an English muffin was actually here in the USA. But both things I think could be had with a cup of tea. And let me get the name right. I think it was Kieran Moden was the gentleman who suggested cup of tea as a very, very English thing. Many British people would say that tea is, a uniquely special, wonderful English thing, and I did a previous episode, the deep dive into tea, and then I believe a deep dive into tea too, where we talked about this, and it's kind of interesting that tea is such a British thing, and we don't grow it anywhere in the UK that I know of. We get it from India, and then before that from China. So, of course, I lived in China for 6 years, and tea culture there is very, very, very interesting and quite different from our tea culture. We don't drink the most tea per capita in the world, although we do beat China. I believe it's Ireland and Turkey managed to beat us on drinking more tea per capita than British people, but it certainly is a big part of British culture. Ladies Who Bond on Instagram asked me to talk about cooking, and perhaps that's because on Instagram I like to share some of my cooking from time to time. My Instagram is Fleming Never Dies, and it's really focused on the Ian Fleming creation, James Bond, and as part of that I often share dishes that are referenced in the Ian Fleming novels. It's something that doesn't really carry over from book to film, but Ian Fleming loved to talk about food. There's over 70 dishes in his 14 books on James Bond, and even his children's book, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, actually has a complete recipe for fudge, which I tried a little while ago. So I enjoy trying this. Ian Fleming would generally write about non-English food, because it's as James Bond travels around the world, he will sample all the different dishes he encounters. But there are a few English dishes that he does go into. The English breakfast, I think, is detailed in From Russia with Love. As I remember, I probably should have looked this up beforehand, I don't think there's black pudding. And I lived in the north of England where black pudding is an essential part of it. And the English breakfast changes all around the UK, so I know there's an Irish breakfast where the bread is soda bread. Every region might have its own variation, just like high tea and cream tea. For me, the afternoon tea that's best is Betty's tea, which when I was a child I think there were only 3 locations. Now I believe there are 6, but all of them are in Yorkshire, and their version for me is the best. Especially there's a cookie, a cake, a thing called a fat rascal, which I've learned to make is a traditional Yorkshire recipe, and what can I say except it's worth a Google. A fat rascal is like a big cookie or biscuit, and again, I believe 2/3 of my listeners are in the United States, where the vocabulary for biscuits and cookies is just different. And I often used to puzzle over this, and I was in a British-American office where we'd really try and define what is a biscuit, what is a cookie. And I have to say, now I'm in the United States, I think it's really just down to the fact that we have different foods. So naturally we end up with, we have similar words, or the same words, for slightly different things, because we're eating different things. So I don't want to go too deep into cooking, because although I love cooking, I think sometimes it's easier if you have the imagery, and you do have like great English chefs. Delia Smith, growing up, was really, really popular. There's Mrs. Beeton, was the first celebrity chef back in the Victorian era, who had the famous direction, first catch your chicken. And then you've got a whole range of celebrity chefs now, like Gordon Ramsay or Jamie Oliver. Although Bond on a Budget was suggesting chips. Chips as the ultimate British food there, so C is for chips, and fish and chips is the kind of the iconic British dish, I think, especially because so many people live around the coast, and so you get fresh fish, so naturally you do something with it. So yeah, fish and chips has become the iconic British dish. I wouldn't say that I have it too often, but then I've sometimes lived a bit further inland, and it's really, really good when it's fresh. So I wouldn't say London is the best place to have it necessarily. I'd say going all around the south coast or on the northeast coast, where you get a very good fishing industry, is the best place. Although I've had some really good fish and chips in Scotland as well. I guess the other end of the scale is Shrubland's Fitness was suggesting cucumber sandwiches, referenced in the movie Moonraker. Again, I think it was the Earl of Sandwich, wasn't it, who popularised the sandwich, and it is, again, a classic finger food. So there we go. C is for crumpets, cream tea, cup of tea, cooking, chips, and cucumber sandwiches. I find it really interesting that most people are rarely focusing on food and drink. Okay. Now we have a series of different C's. Like I said, 25 people messaged me about a whole range of different topics, and so I'd like to cover as many of them as possible. One of them was recommended by two people, the Shofi and Sergio Acevedolian, and my apologies for hesitating in how I pronounce the name. I'm genuinely not sure. I hope I got it right. These two people, the Shofi and Sergio, recommended chap, as C is for chap, which instantly made me think of the Chap magazine. So the Chap magazine was founded in 1999. I first came across it as on a naval ship, and I went over to talk to somebody who was an officer, and he had this magazine, and it was pages and pages and pages of braces, or suspenders if you're from America, and reviewing the braces, which were not so popular at the time. I was very curious about it, and he told me, yeah, it's the Chap magazine. They have a series of points in their manifesto. 1, thou shalt always wear tweed, definitively Chap fabric. Thou shalt never not smoke, saying that everyone should smoke a pipe. Thou shalt always be courteous to ladies, always offer a lady your seat, and if the lady objects, she's not a real lady. Thou shalt never ever wear pantaloons de nimes, which is their word for jeans. Thou shalt always doff one's hat. Alright, so you own a couple of trilbies, good for you, but it's hardly going to change the world. Once you start actually lifting them off your head when greeting, then the revolution will truly begin. So there we go. Thou shalt never fasten the lowest button on thy waistcoat. We don't make the rules, we simply try and keep them going. This one dates back to Edward VII, sufficient reason in itself to observe it, and so on and so on. Talked about the wonders of the trouser press. I believe they did a Chap Olympics a few years ago, in which I think it was 1 out of 100 points was for coming first in the race, and all the others were for, gentlemanly conduct, having properly pressed trousers, not allowing oneself to overexert oneself, things like that. So yes, it's a tongue-in-cheek magazine, but I think it gives a very good insight into what we mean when we say chap, and I haven't heard too many people from other countries use the word chap. Oh, he's a nice chap. I just haven't heard people from other countries use it, unless they've come across British people who have been in all British offices, the only American or Australian. So yeah, I think it's a uniquely British thing. 3 people messaged me asking me to talk about cricket. cricket is the national sport, officially. I think all British people have played it. Bond on This Day, Behind the Stunts, and Josh Trent all suggested cricket, and it's a very old-fashioned sport, I guess, but it's very much one that's still going. My nephew was recently part of the team that won the County League Championships for under-11s, so I was very, very pleased to see my nephew in cricket whites. And maybe it's worth just going quickly through the local news article and just seeing what there is easy to understand for people who don't play cricket. So they, of course, wish all congratulations to the successful team. They're talking about the two young fellows who got off the innings to a solid start, although on a couple of early wickets kept the score in check. So the wickets, they've got 3 pieces of wood that stand upright, and then 2 that rest on top. So the 3 that are upright are called stumps, the 2 that rest on top are wickets. I'm kind of hoping that you've seen an image of cricket at some point before. The game, I have to say, is not so dissimilar to baseball, except that with baseball, when you're throwing, you're going for kind of an invisible square. The pitcher has to get it within that square as he's pitching, otherwise it's out. Whereas with cricket, you're aiming for those stumps. It's physical, it's manifest, you can see it, and the batter is defending those stumps. So if the ball hits the stumps and the wickets fall off, then he's out. Same as if it's 3 strikes, but in this case it's 1 hit. So you are defending that, and if you hit the ball, then you can run to the other stumps. There's 2, and you run backwards and forwards to earn your scores, unless the ball goes outside the boundary, and if it hits the ground before the boundary and then rolls out, that's a 4, and if it just flies out and then lands beyond the boundary, that's a 6. And I'm hoping I'm getting it right, because I haven't played it since I was a child. And I have to say, I don't follow cricket very, very closely, except obviously my nephew playing, and then I was deeply, deeply invested. Actually, I did watch a match, I think 3 years ago, which was the last time I was in the UK. But again, it was travelling amateur teams. I believe one was an Australian team visiting, doing very, very well. But again, I really grew up with cricket as a village game. So you'd go to a village fair and you would have, you'd have cricket as the centrepiece to the event, and then all around it you might have, homemade cakes on sale, you might have a vegetable competition, vegetable growing competition I should say, and a whole bunch of other kind of little events all going around, but the cricket was very much the centre, and then everything else was kind of orbiting around it. Shrublands Fitness was suggesting croquet as well, which made me stop and think, because I've lived in a few countries as an adult, Turkish Cyprus, Saudi Arabia, Oman, China and the UK, now the USA, and I haven't seen croquet. I don't think I've seen it as an adult, so I must have just seen it as a child, where you get all these little hoops all around a garden, and then you're kind of basically putting this very solid ball all around, all through the hoops, through this kind of cool obstacle course. So I remember playing it quite a lot as a child, but I genuinely hadn't thought of it probably in a decade. So thank you very much, Shrublands Fitness, for giving me many happy memories. Again, I don't know where it could be found elsewhere in the world. Most of my listeners are not based in the UK, which genuinely surprised me. I thought when I started this podcast, British people would be fascinated to hear about themselves and to complain when I get it wrong, or wrong by their experience, right? The UK is quite diverse. But in fact, most listeners, I say, are in the United States. So if you're American, you're playing croquet, let me know, because as I say, I haven't come across it, I think, since I was a child. Okay, so far we've talked about crumpets, cream tea, cooking, chips, cup of tea, cucumber sandwiches, chap, cricket and croquet. So all the different things that C in the alphabet of Britishness can stand for. I like the suggestions from Josh Trett that C is for crown, and Jason Kim, JASXON88 on Instagram, suggested Claire Foy, which after a quick Google told me that she was the star of the TV show The Crown for the first 2 seasons. Although I'm British, and I know it's supposed to be a very, very British show, I've never seen it, but I've heard very good reviews of The Crown. As I understand, it largely plays out kind of what we popularly know about the royal family, dramatising a few things here and there and taking certain liberties at what happened behind closed doors. But I know it's been a huge international export, along with, say, Downton Abbey, which I have also never seen, or at least I think I've seen one or maybe half of an episode. But The Crown is a hugely successful TV show, and if you talk about kings and queens, I think most people would really think about the British royal family. There are other royal families in the modern day. Of course, the Japanese have their imperial royal family. I believe the Dutch have a royal family. But in terms of what we classically think of as kings and queens, people think of it as the British royal family. There's the old joke that one day there'll only be 5 queens in the world, 4 in a pack of cards, and 1 the Queen of England. Which makes the following 4, which are from my friend Kane in China, so deeply interesting. Because he suggested Cromwell, Civil War, Constitution, and Commonwealth. We tend to think of France as having the revolution that really started the fire that went round the world of revolution and anti-monarchy. But before all that, England had already done it. So England had a civil war between Charles I and Parliament, and this was the civil war that brought Cromwell to prominence. I'd just been listening to a biography of him from the BBC. It was kind of an alternative take, but he was a small landowner from East Anglia who rose in prominence as there was tension between the king and Parliament about the right of the king to gather taxes. So the king wanted to impose taxes largely to pay for a fleet. And Parliament said no taxation without representation. I think to American listeners this will all sound very familiar. A lot of the beats of the English Civil War are to be found in the American Revolution, and in fact George Washington cited Cromwell as one of his heroes, at least one of his heroes with certain qualifications. Cromwell was a fiery, passionate man, a very religious man, a man who could be studied, well, you could spend your lifetime studying his life, although we don't know much about his very early life. His career as a soldier, first of all, was phenomenally successful. As I say, rose to prominence, as I say, in the 17th century. That's the English Civil War. And, well, it was partly thanks to him that England executed its own king on trial for treason. If you don't know how the English Civil War ended, well, I'm sorry, I've spoiled the whole thing, but it was a fascinating part of history, again for a country that most people would think of as a staunch monarchy. There are people who still think Parliament was right, and as I say, Parliament won the Civil War, again largely using very similar techniques to what you saw in the American Revolution. So it is a fascinating one. Cromwell himself, Oliver Cromwell, is a really interesting guy. The Civil War, I'd say, is gripping, and as I say, it's similar to the American Revolution, including the role of German mercenaries. It really is very similar. It affected the English constitution, who has authority, the king or Parliament, and that kind of tension we had between the two was really defined in that era. And then we had the Commonwealth, the fourth C that Kane suggested, which is where Parliament ruled, or rather Oliver Cromwell ruled. So having fought against dictators, Cromwell naturally became a dictator, the dictator who famously cancelled Christmas. So he was, much hated at the end of his life, and greatly loved, say, at the apogee of fighting against the monarchy. So he is a very complex and very interesting character, so I love it. 4 C's. C is for Cromwell, Civil War, Constitution and Commonwealth. But it's such a deep topic. All I've been able to really say is the outline of what these things are. And already I see the rabbit hole that I could go down for every one of them. So I think I'm going to skip along, perhaps cycle back to this one. As I say, any one of these 4 could be a podcast in itself, and I hope you'd find this as interesting as I do. But this war is a gripping topic, covering politics, religion, economics, and philosophy of how a country should really be run. As I say, ultimately we defaulted back to having a monarchy, so we have Charles II and his glorious revolution, bringing back the monarchy by popular demand. But he spent very little of his time in politics. So there we have our fifth C: Cromwell, Civil War, Constitution, Commonwealth, and Charles. Charles I, who initiated the Civil War, and Charles II, who brought the monarchy back. Of course, we will see one day what Charles III will do. To move on to very different things, Italian Matt on Instagram suggested camaraderie, and Curtis Strollery suggested courage, which made me wonder, how can I relate these to British culture? England is a very interesting place, and the United Kingdom together a very interesting place in terms of countries we have invaded. So, of course, I lived in Turkish Cyprus. Cyprus was part of the British Empire. I worked in China. Yes, we've invaded China. I've worked in Saudi Arabia. Of course, Lawrence of Arabia was very active there. Oman. Quite a few places where I'm not the first Brit to go. And indeed, quite a few military fellas have been before me. This was covered in a book by Stuart Laycock that I really enjoy, called All the Countries We've Ever Invaded, and a Few We Never Got Round To. In this, he talks about there's over 190 odd member states of the United Nations. Just taking those member states of the United Nations, and of course there's countries that aren't members, but just taking those, just under 200, he suggested in the first edition there were only 23 countries in the world Britain had not invaded, and that includes Vatican City. I believe later editions talk about how there's only 22, as historians had written to him talking about how Britain had actually invaded Mongolia, although most of what we've done around the world is, of course, through naval engagements and around the coast, and Mongolia is, of course, a landlocked nation. But nonetheless, we have left our footprint around the world. A matter of some controversy for a lot of British people, although as I travel around the world, as I say in Cyprus, where I lived for so long, of course the British Empire had invaded. Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, Richard Coeur de Lion, depending which name you prefer, had invaded the island twice. But he was just one of around 30 different empires that invaded over different times. So he's just part of the rich, colourful history of the island. But that did get to what Donny Waldron of Quantum of History suggested I should talk about, which is Cacafuego, which means the ship that poops fire. So this was a ship attacked by Francis Drake, El Draco. He was the man who is frequently cited in the book All the Countries We've Ever Invaded, and a Few We Never Got Round To, since he covered so much of South America for us. He was variously what you might call a pirate. He was actually a privateer. He was licensed by the British Crown to attack whatever Spanish ships you like, as there was war between England and Spain. So he was phenomenally successful. He did, of course, circumnavigate the world, the first Englishman to do it, not the first man in the world to do it. But he was a man at war, and a man who, well, perhaps I should save Francis Drake for F for Francis or D for Drake, but he was the saviour of England in the Elizabethan era, and not entirely popular in Spain, since he captured so many of their great ships and attacked so many of their settlements in South America, but very, very successfully, and was thought to be a gentleman, to Queen Elizabeth I at least, putting down his cape in front of her when there's a puddle, so that she didn't have to step in a puddle, she could just step on his cape. So, the ship that poops fire, Cacafuego. Fantastic suggestion from Mr. Quantum of History. There are many that remain, which again, they're just topics I don't know so well. I quite like N. Slayton suggested carless, because, living in the United States, I see how vital and important it is for everyone to have a car. At least in California, you can hardly get anywhere without a car, whereas in the UK I've happily lived, of course much of my time in England was as a child, but as an adult I was happily working in the UK without a car. I'd just walk, take a train, take the bus, maybe a friend's car, but no, most of the time I didn't need a car in the UK, whereas here in California, you definitely need one. Churchill was suggested by Phil Nobile Jr. on Instagram, and again it's a bit like Cromwell, Civil War, Constitution, Commonwealth, Charles I. it's a deep topic. You could talk about Churchill for a long time. And again, it's something that seemed to be universally agreed upon, that Churchill was a national hero, and he is now on our £5 banknote. Relatively recently, at least as far as I'm concerned, again, having spent many years outside the UK, but now more and more contested as people look at his views on colonialism and so on. So again, that's been relatively recent as far as I'm concerned. Cockney was suggested by James Burb, and I believe it was anyone born within a certain distance being able to hear the bells of... Is it Bow Bells? Oh no, I'm not quite sure. It's too London for me. I lived in Yorkshire and I've never lived in London. I haven't visited that many times, to my mind anyway. So no, I'm not going to talk about Cockneys. It is a unique way of speaking, but it's probably been supplanted by Estuary English. I don't know if anyone describes themselves as Cockney now. I think they probably just refer to their area of London. But again, if you're in London, if you consider yourself a Cockney, do write in. Because again, I'm doing this series partly learning about the UK and British culture generally myself. Jason Kim again suggested Canterbury Tales, which is a fantastic collection of stories from a time before spelling. So I must admit, I've taken the shortcut and read modern translations. I believe we do study it in schools at the right ages, but I was at the wrong age. As I said, I wasn't in the UK studying that. And Niven Bespoke had a really cool one, which was the Carry On movies, which again was really popular, I guess, after the Ealing comedies. The Ealing comedies really go for the early part of the 20th century and carry on 60s, 70s. It's again something that I know of, but again, perhaps I need more information than I've had time to get into, because I didn't really grow up on the Carry On movies. And finally, from two green thumbs, Cats, Crikey, and Catastrophic. England is a nation of animal lovers. I'd say British people generally love animals. Crikey, again, one of those unique English expressions of surprise. Catastrophic, well, although I tend to be quite sunny, I think a lot of British people tend to look at the negative. It just tends to be. So, before I asked anybody else what C should stand for, I kind of made my own list. Actually, I've made a list of the whole alphabet of what I think, and I always find it fascinating to see what from my list people suggest and what from my list nobody suggests. So I found it very, very interesting that nobody, on Instagram, on my Chinese websites, nobody suggested Christianity or Church of England, which England is a constitutionally Christian country. There are bishops in the House of Lords, whilst in America there's the separation between church and state. And yet every politician tends to talk about one nation under God, and do talk about their faith a great deal. Well, the United Kingdom is constitutionally Christian, whereas politicians generally don't talk about religion. Most politicians don't mention God. I believe Tony Blair did right at the end of his premiership, but at the beginning certainly never mentioned it. So I find that fascinating. The Queen is the head of the Church of England, so it's not taken care of by our politicians. It tends to be taken care of, I say, by the royal family and by our bishops. I guess our bishops from time to time are criticised for talking politics, but usually it's when they're talking about the poor and needy needing help, which, to be fair, seems to me more their kind of topic. So again, we are a constitutionally Christian country, and one might point out, a Protestant country, so a lot of our history, I mentioned Francis Drake earlier fighting the Spanish, because the Spanish were Catholics, and Britain had become a Protestant country at that time. So again, it's been a definitive part of our history. But now, as I say, I asked Instagram, I asked a lot of my friends elsewhere, what does C stand for in the Alphabet of Britishness? More than 25 people responded, and nobody said that. Which may be a change in perception over time, could be a change of priorities. Just find it interesting. So finally, I'd just like to say thank you very much to everybody who contacted me. C is for crumpets, C is for cream tea, C is for cooking, chips, cup of tea, cucumber sandwiches, chap, cricket, croquet, crown, Cromwell, Civil War, Constitution, Commonwealth. I added in Charles I and Charles II. Camaraderie, courage, cacafuego. Thank you, Quantum of History. Carlos. Oh, I must have a quick shout out to Kid Bond fan who suggested Cumbria, Coventry and Cornwall. There are a few people who suggested place names, but Kid Bond fan had a really good selection, and I do want to cover this in a future episode. In fact, I'd quite like to cover quite a few areas of England which are not London. London gets very well represented in the media, but it's not where most people live. And again, I mentioned earlier with Cockneys, I haven't spent enough time in London to really talk about London culture generally, let alone Cockneys. But I spent more time in Cumbria. I know Coventry. And again, I just feel there's probably a space out there to talk about England outside London. So that's something that will come up in the future. Again, talked about Churchill very briefly because it's a topic that probably deserves a deep dive. Same as Canterbury Tales, but I don't know if I have the authority to go into that. I might have to find an expert to interview, if there's one out there. If you're interested in being one of my British experts, do send me a message. And if you'd like to help people find this podcast, if you think it was any good at all, then please do leave a review on whatever podcasting app you listen on. Most people are listening on iTunes, so please do review this on iTunes. Give your honest 5-star review. Please do. As I say, it helps people find this podcast. C is for Crumpets. Thank you very, very much for listening.